Welcome back to Threads of Kindness. Today, we delve into 3 unforgettable stories that showcase the resilience and determination of everyday people. From a mother's battle to protect her daughter, to a young woman standing up to chaos in her community, and a homeowner embracing creativity despite opposition, these tales will inspire and move you. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let's explore the power of courage and compassion together. When I first met Ryan, I thought I had finally found someone to build a life with. I was in my late 20s, working as a receptionist at a small medical clinic. My life was steady but far from extraordinary. Like anyone, I dreamed of love, stability, and a family of my own. Ryan came into my life like a whirlwind, charming, attentive, and full of promises. Our relationship started quickly, and I fell harder than I ever thought I could. He seemed perfect, always saying the right things and making me feel like I was the most important person in the world. "I can see myself spending my life with you," he once said, his eyes locking with mine during one of our late-night conversations. "You're everything I've ever wanted." It wasn't long before we talked about having a family. I had always wanted to be a mother, and Ryan's excitement made me feel like my dreams were finally coming true. Things took a turn a few months later when I found out I was pregnant. I remember the moment vividly. It was both thrilling and terrifying. I had never been a mother before, and I knew the journey ahead would be challenging. But I believed in Ryan and the life we were building together. When I told him the news, I expected joy, maybe even tears of happiness. Instead, I was met with disbelief. "Wait," he said, his face blank. "Are you serious?" "Yes," I replied, trying to gauge his reaction. "We're going to have a baby." Ryan's smile faded, replaced by an uneasy expression. I don't think I'm ready for this." His words felt like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "We talked about starting a family." "That was just talk, okay?" he said, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't think it would actually happen, at least not now." In the days that followed, Ryan became distant. He stopped calling, stopped coming over, and when I reached out to him, he always had an excuse. I tried to give him time, hoping he would come around, but deep down, I knew he wasn't coming back. A few weeks later, I finally confronted him. "Ryan," I said, standing at his doorstep, "I need to know where we stand. Are you going to be a part of this child's life or not?" He sighed, looking anywhere but at me. "I don't think I can do this," he said bluntly. "I'm not ready to be a dad." "But this is your child," I said, my voice breaking. "You can't just walk away." "I didn't ask for this," he snapped. "Look, I'm sorry, but I can't be what you need me to be. I don't want this responsibility." His words left me stunned, tears streaming down my face as I realized I was on my own. From that day forward, I had to navigate the realities of pregnancy alone. There was no partner to lean on, no one to share the excitement or the fear. I worked long hours to save money, knowing I'd need every penny to support my baby. When I reached out to Ryan again, asking for financial help, his response was as cold as ever. "I told you already," he said over the phone. "I don't want anything to do with you or that baby. Stop calling me." And just like that, he hung up, leaving me to face the challenges ahead without him. Every day was a battle, physically, emotionally, and financially. But despite the pain and the heartbreak, I refused to give up. This child, my child, was my world now. And for them, I would fight with everything I had. The first time Ryan reached out in years, I couldn't believe my eyes. His name popped up on my phone like a ghost from the past, stirring memories I had tried so hard to bury. Against my better judgment, I answered, "Hey," he said awkwardly, his voice too casual for someone who had abandoned their child. "It's been a while. I was wondering if we could talk." "What do you want, Ryan?" I asked, my voice cold and guarded. He hesitated, then dropped the bombshell. "I want to meet her, our daughter. It's Christmas, and I think it's time we reconnect." Reconnect? The audacity of that word almost made me laugh. After 7 years of silence, he suddenly wanted to be a father. Despite my instincts screaming at me to hang up, I thought of my daughter. She had asked about her father once or twice, and while I had always shielded her from the truth, I knew there was a part of her that wondered. "Fine," I said reluctantly. "You can meet her, but only under my supervision." On Christmas Day, I brought my daughter, Emma, to the park where Ryan had asked to meet. Emma, who had no idea who Ryan really was excited about the outing. As we waited, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. Ryan arrived with a woman I didn't recognize. She had a warm smile, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "This is my wife, Linda," Ryan said, introducing her without so much as a warning. Linda knelt down to Emma's level, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Oh my goodness, you're even more beautiful than I imagined," she said, her voice trembling. You look just like... She trailed off, standing abruptly and wiping her eyes. I didn't like the way she looked at Emma, like she was seeing someone else entirely. The day seemed to go smoothly at first. Emma played on the swings while Linda and Ryan tried to make small talk with me, but something felt off. Linda's questions about Emma were invasive, almost desperate. Does she like dolls? Tea parties? Oh, and what about braiding hair? Does she let you braid her hair? Linda asked in rapid succession. Before I could respond, Emma ran over, laughing, and Linda immediately scooped her up in a hug. It was too much, too fast. I gently pulled Emma away. That night, as I tucked Emma into bed, my phone buzzed with a message from Ryan. Linda wants to see Emma again. She feels like this is helping her heal. I frowned, confused. Helping her heal? What did that mean? The next visit, everything became clear. Ryan and Linda had invited us to their home. Reluctantly, I agreed, thinking it might help establish boundaries. When we arrived, I was immediately on edge. The house was decorated with Christmas lights, but what caught my attention was a picture frame on the mantel. It showed a little girl who looked eerily similar to Emma, except her eyes were blue instead of brown. "That's our daughter Sarah," Linda said softly, noticing my gaze. "She passed away last year." "I'm so sorry," I said automatically, though my heart was racing. "Thank you," Linda replied, her voice trembling. "But now we have Emma." I froze. "What do you mean, we have Emma?" Linda smiled through tears. "She's just like Sarah. It feels like Sarah is back with us." Ryan stepped in. "We've been through a lot, and Linda needs this. She's finally smiling again." "You can't be serious," I said, anger bubbling in my chest. "Emma is not Sarah. She's not some replacement for your loss." Linda's expression hardened. "You don't understand. This is good for her, for all of us." "No," I said firmly, grabbing Emma's hand. "This isn't happening. We're leaving." Ryan blocked the door. "Don't overreact. Linda just wants to spend time with her. We can make this work." "Make this work?" I nearly shouted. "She's not a pawn in your therapy session, Ryan. She's my daughter, not yours. You gave up that right years ago." His face darkened. "She's my blood too. I have rights." "Not anymore," I said coldly. "You forfeited them when you walked away." I left that house, shaking with anger and fear. Over the next few days, Ryan's messages became increasingly hostile. "You can't keep her from me," he wrote. "Linda needs this. Emma needs this." I saved every message and immediately contacted a lawyer. In the weeks that followed, I worked tirelessly to secure a protective order. My lawyer assured me that Ryan's abandonment and Linda's behavior would make a strong case. One day, as I was packing up our apartment in preparation for a move, there was a knock at the door. It was Ryan. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping the chain on the door. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. "You're overreacting." "No, Ryan, I'm protecting my daughter. You have no place in her life anymore." His calm demeanor snapped. "You're being selfish! Linda just lost her child, and you're taking this away from her?" I slammed the door in his face, my hands trembling. The court hearing was quick and decisive. The judge granted the protective order, citing Ryan's neglect and Linda's inappropriate behavior as major concerns. After the ruling, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I knew the fight wasn't entirely over. Ryan and Linda might try again. But I was ready to do whatever it took to keep Emma safe. We moved to a new city, far from the chaos they had brought into our lives. Emma thrived in her new environment, blissfully unaware of the turmoil I had shielded her from. As I watched her play in the backyard of our new home, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. "Mommy, are you okay?" Emma asked, running up to me with a smile. I knelt down and hugged her tightly. "I'm perfect," I said, tears in my eyes. For the first time in a long time, I truly believed it. Emma was safe, and that was all that mattered. Emma had envisioned her new apartment as a peaceful escape from the hustle and bustle of the city. The modest complex, nestled in a quiet neighborhood, seemed perfect for her. The rent was reasonable, the neighbors appeared friendly enough, and her corner unit offered a cozy sense of privacy. After months of saving and planning, she finally moved in, arranging her furniture and adding personal touches that made the space feel like home. For the first few weeks, everything seemed ideal, but then the trouble began. Emma first noticed the teenagers next door while bringing in groceries one evening. A group of them loitered near the stairwell, laughing and shouting loudly. At first, she thought little of it, just kids being kids. But over time, their presence became impossible to ignore. They crowded the shared spaces, blocked the stairs with their bikes, and left litter scattered around the complex. Their antics were annoying, but Emma decided to let it slide. After all, she didn't want to start her new life by complaining about her neighbors. Things escalated quickly. One night, Emma was jolted awake by loud banging on her door. Groggy and disoriented, she hesitated before peeking through the peephole. No one was there, but she could hear muffled laughter as footsteps echoed down the hall. A few days later, she found a scratch running along the side of her car, as if someone had deliberately keyed it. Frustrated but unsure of what to do, Emma tried to brush it off as an isolated incident. The breaking point came one sunny Saturday morning. Emma walked outside to discover her brand new car tires had been slashed. A sinking feeling of anger and helplessness washed over her. These weren't random acts anymore. This was targeted vandalism. She suspected the teens next door were responsible, but she had no proof. Her mind raced as she stood by her car, wondering how she could afford to replace the tires and whether she'd ever feel safe in her own home again. Emma wasn't the only tenant affected by the chaos. She began noticing other residents dealing with similar issues. One neighbor mentioned their window had been broken by a rock, while another complained about noise from late-night parties hosted by the teens. The parents seemed entirely unconcerned, brushing off complaints with half-hearted apologies or outright denial. "They're just kids," the mother said dismissively one afternoon when Emma tried to bring up the issue. Determined not to let the situation spiral further, Emma reported the incidents to building management. But the property manager, a frazzled man named Mr. Peterson, was less than helpful. "We'll look into it," he said vaguely, flipping through a clipboard without meeting her eyes. Emma could tell he had no intention of addressing the problem. Frustrated and feeling powerless, she realized she would have to take matters into her own hands. The following weekend, Emma purchased a small security camera and installed it outside her apartment door. It wasn't much, but it gave her a sense of control over an otherwise chaotic situation. She also began keeping a detailed record of every incident, noting dates, times, and descriptions of the teens' behavior. If no one else was going to hold them accountable, she would. Meanwhile, the teens continued their disruptive antics. They banged on doors, shouted obscenities in the parking lot, and left trash strewn across the complex. Emma's camera captured snippets of their behavior, one boy kicking over a trash can, another riding a bike through the flower beds. But it wasn't enough to take definitive action. She needed clear, undeniable proof. Her opportunity came one quiet evening. Emma was relaxing in her living room when she heard a loud thud outside. She rushed to her window and saw one of the teens sitting on the hood of her car, surrounded by his friends. Her heart sank as she watched him lean back, his sneakers scraping against the paint. Without hesitation, she grabbed her phone and pulled up the camera feed. There it was, clear footage of the teens damaging her car. Emma wasted no time. The next morning, she marched into the property manager's office with her camera in hand. "Mr. Peterson," she began, her voice firm, "this has to stop. I have proof of what's been happening." She played the footage for him, watching as his expression shifted from disinterest to alarm. The evidence was damning, and Peterson could no longer ignore the problem. "This is serious," he admitted reluctantly. "If there's one more incident like this, we'll have grounds to issue an eviction notice." Emma left the office feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. She had taken a step forward, but she knew the teens wouldn't stop without a fight. Still, she was determined to see justice served, even if it meant standing alone against her unruly neighbors. The following days were tense, with Emma constantly on edge. She had finally gotten through to Mr. Peterson, but she knew it wasn't over. The teens next door had a pattern, and she suspected they'd retaliate. Her intuition proved correct. One evening, as Emma was unwinding after a long day at work, the faint sound of muffled voices and laughter reached her ears. She glanced out her window and saw the group of teens lingering near the parking lot. Her stomach tightened. This time, however, they weren't just sitting around. They seemed to be inspecting her car again. Emma quickly pulled up her security camera feed on her phone. Sure enough, the teens were back to their antics. One of them leaned casually against her car, while another paced around it, gesturing animatedly. A third boy picked up a rock, pretending to throw it at a nearby bush. Emma's pulse quickened as she watched, knowing she couldn't just sit idly by. She stepped outside, her phone recording in hand. "Hey!" she called firmly, her voice cutting through the still evening air. The group froze, their laughter dying instantly. Emma approached them, her heart racing, but her resolve firm. "What do you think you're doing?" The boy leaning against her car shrugged, his smirk defiant. "Just hanging out," he said, his tone dripping with insolence. "Well, this is private property," Emma replied, her voice steady. "You have no business being near my car. Leave, now!" The teens exchanged glances, and for a moment it seemed they might comply. But then one of them, the tallest of the group, stepped forward. "You can't tell us what to do," he said, crossing his arms. This isn't your street. Emma didn't flinch. No, but this is my car, and I have you on camera from the last time you damaged it. She held up her phone, showing the screen where a recording was clearly visible. If you don't leave now, I'll be sending this to the property manager and the police. That was enough to rattle them. The tallest boy faltered, his bravado slipping as he glanced at his friends. Whatever, he muttered, turning away. The others followed, grumbling under their breath. Emma stood her ground, watching as they disappeared around the corner. Her heart was pounding, but she refused to let them see her fear. Back inside her apartment, Emma reviewed the footage and emailed it to Mr. Peterson immediately. She included a detailed account of what had just happened, emphasizing her growing concern for her safety. Within minutes, she received a reply. "Thank you for this. I'll escalate the issue immediately." The next morning, Mr. Peterson knocked on Emma's door. He looked unusually serious, clipboard in hand. "I've filed the paperwork for an eviction notice," he said, his tone decisive. "I'll be delivering it to their unit this afternoon." Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "I just want this to stop." Peterson nodded. "So do I. We've received multiple complaints about them now, and your video footage sealed the deal. They'll have 30 days to vacate." That evening, as Emma returned home from work, she noticed an unfamiliar tension in the air. The teen's apartment was unusually quiet, the curtains drawn. For the first time in weeks, there were no loud voices echoing through the hallways, no bikes clogging the stairwell. It was almost eerie, but the peace didn't last long. Around midnight, Emma was startled awake by a loud crash outside her window. She bolted upright, her heart racing as she rushed to the window to see what had happened. Below, in the parking lot, her car's rear window had been shattered. The teens were nowhere in sight, but Emma didn't need to see them to know who was responsible. She immediately called the police, explaining the situation in detail. Within 20 minutes, an officer arrived to assess the damage. Emma showed him the security footage she had captured earlier, as well as the emails and eviction notice she'd received from Mr. Peterson. The officer nodded grimly, taking notes as Emma recounted the harassment she had endured. "We'll file a report and speak to the neighbors," he assured her. "This kind of behavior won't be tolerated." The officer's presence seemed to have a chilling effect. By morning, word had spread about the police visit, and the teen's family received yet another formal warning. Mr. Peterson followed up with a personal visit to ensure they understood the gravity of the situation. For the next few days, the complex was quieter than it had been in months. Emma still felt uneasy, but she took solace in knowing that the eviction process was underway. Every step brought her closer to regaining the peace and security she had worked so hard to build in her home. But the battle wasn't over yet. She could feel it in the air. This wasn't the last she'd hear from her unruly neighbors. Emma awoke the next day to an uncharacteristic quiet. The usual sounds of yelling teens and slammed doors were gone, replaced by a tense stillness. She checked her security camera feed, half expecting to catch some mischief, but the screens revealed nothing. The teens and their families seemed to have gone dormant, but Emma knew better than to believe they'd simply given up. Later that afternoon, as Emma sat at her desk catching up on work, a knock at her door startled her. She opened it to find Mr. Peterson standing there, looking unusually composed, but with a hint of unease in his posture. "They've contested the eviction notice," he said. "They've filed a complaint, claiming harassment and discrimination." Emma's stomach dropped. "What? Harassment? I've been the one dealing with their harassment for months." Peterson sighed. "I know. The footage and reports you've provided are solid, and we have a strong case. But this will delay the process. It'll likely go before a mediation board." Emma clenched her fists, her frustration boiling over. "How long are we talking?" "Another month, maybe 2, Peterson replied, his voice low. "In the meantime, I've asked the local police to increase patrols, and we'll continue documenting everything." Emma nodded, though the idea of enduring this situation for another few months left her feeling deflated. "Thanks for letting me know," she said, closing the door behind him. Determined not to be a victim, Emma doubled down on her vigilance. She adjusted her camera angles, making sure every corner of her property was covered. She also kept a detailed journal of every incident, no matter how minor, knowing it could be the difference between winning and losing the case. A few nights later, Emma was startled awake by a familiar sound, muffled voices and footsteps near her car. Her heart raced as she grabbed her phone and opened the security camera app. There they were, the teens, huddled around her car, clearly up to no good. She immediately dialed the police, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "This is Emma Walker," she said, giving her address. "I have live footage of my neighbors vandalizing my car again. Please send someone immediately." Within minutes, the flashing lights of a patrol car illuminated the parking lot. The teens scattered like roaches, but one was too slow, caught red-handed by the responding officer. Emma watched from her window as the officer questioned the boy, who stammered excuses that were obviously lies. Another officer knocked on the neighbor's door, and after several minutes, the parents emerged, clearly annoyed and defensive. The officer spoke firmly, his voice carrying across the quiet night. "This behavior stops now. You've been warned repeatedly, and we have video evidence. If there's another incident, we'll escalate this to criminal charges." The parents argued, claiming their children were being targeted unfairly, but the officer wasn't swayed. "Your family's actions have been documented extensively. The law is clear." The next morning, Emma woke to an unexpected scene. The family's belongings were being packed into a moving truck. Apparently, the mounting complaints and police involvement had pushed them to leave before the eviction process could officially conclude. Relief flooded Emma as she watched from her window. The teens sulked as they loaded boxes, their parents snapping orders and bickering loudly. For the first time in months, Emma felt like she could breathe. By the end of the day, the troublesome family was gone. The complex buzzed with quiet satisfaction as neighbors exchanged knowing glances and whispered conversations. Emma received a call from Mr. Peterson that evening. "It's over," he said simply. "They decided to leave voluntarily. I guess the pressure was too much." Emma smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I couldn't have done this without your help." "It was your persistence that made the difference," he replied. "The other tenants owe you a debt of gratitude." As the days passed, the complex returned to its peaceful rhythm. Emma no longer had to worry about slashed tires, broken windows, or sleepless nights. She even began to notice small acts of kindness from her neighbors. An extra smile in the hallway, a cup of coffee left at her door as a thank you. One afternoon, as she walked to her car, the elderly woman from 2 doors down stopped her. "You're the reason we finally have peace around here," she said, her voice warm. "Thank you." Emma felt a swell of pride. It hadn't been easy, but she had stood her ground and refused to be intimidated. The ordeal had taught her the value of resilience and the importance of standing up for what was right. As Emma drove away that evening, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, she felt lighter than she had in months. The nightmare was over, and she had emerged stronger than ever. For the first time, her home truly felt like a sanctuary. A place where she could build a future free of fear and filled with hope. Megan had always been someone who loved expressing herself through creativity. From her wardrobe filled with vibrant patterns to her passion for painting landscapes, she believed in embracing life's colors to the fullest. So when she purchased her bungalow in a quiet neighborhood, she saw it as the perfect blank canvas. The house was a muted beige when she moved in, blending seamlessly with the rest of the cookie-cutter homes on the street. But Megan had other plans. Big, colorful plans. For weeks, she worked tirelessly to create a vision that reflected her personality. She chose a soft, peachy hue for the walls, complemented by sage green shutters and accents of muted pink. The colors were inspired by a picture-perfect sunset she once painted during a trip to Arizona, a palette she found both soothing and uplifting. It wasn't just the house's exterior she transformed. Her garden was a labor of love. She planted bright sunflowers that stretched toward the sky, wildflowers in every imaginable hue, and marigolds that lined the pathway like a glowing carpet. Each morning, Megan would step outside with her watering can and coffee in hand, beaming with pride at her growing masterpiece. But not everyone shared her enthusiasm. Paul, her next-door neighbor, was the embodiment of a traditionalist. He had lived in his house for over 15 years and saw himself as a steward of the neighborhood's character. Paul's own house was a plain gray, with trimmed hedges and a carefully manicured lawn. He took pride in its neatness, though others whispered that it looked more like an office building than a home. When Megan's first coat of peach paint went up, Paul's jaw practically hit the floor. From that day forward, he seemed to be on a mission to make Megan regret her decision. At first, his complaints were subtle. He would mutter things under his breath loud enough for Megan to hear as he passed by her garden. "Looks like someone's trying to start a circus," he grumbled one afternoon as she painted the window frames. Megan smiled politely, pretending not to hear him. She wasn't the type to let someone else's negativity rain on her parade. However, Paul wasn't content with passive-aggressive remarks. One day, as Megan was arranging colorful flags along the pathway, Paul marched over with a clipboard in hand. His stiff posture and furrowed brow made it clear he meant business. "Excuse me, Megan," he began, his tone as tight as the tie he wore to work every day. "Do you think all of this," he gestured vaguely at her house and garden, "is appropriate for our neighborhood? We have a certain standard to maintain." Megan looked up from her work, unfazed. "Good morning, Paul," she said cheerfully. "I'm sorry, but I don't recall there being any rules about house colors or gardens here." Paul's face reddened. "It's not about rules, Megan. It's about respect for your neighbors." Megan set down her spade and turned to face him fully. "Respect works both ways, Paul. This is my home, and I'm not breaking any laws. I understand my taste might not be for everyone, but it brings me joy. Isn't that what matters?" Paul's lips pressed into a thin line. "You'll see," he muttered, spinning on his heel and storming back to his gray fortress. Megan shook her head, more amused than anything. She had encountered people like Paul before, those who couldn't stand individuality and clung to outdated ideas of conformity. But she wasn't about to let him dim her light. She had just finished painting a set of pavers with her niece, each one featuring whimsical designs like ladybugs, turtles, and flowers. They were to be the centerpiece of her garden walkway, and Megan was determined to finish the project despite Paul's objections. The days passed, and Paul's disapproval grew louder. He began grumbling to other neighbors, hoping to rally them to his cause. "It's an eyesore," he declared at a neighborhood barbecue. "She's turning this place into a circus." But much to Paul's frustration, his complaints didn't gain much traction. Many neighbors admired Megan's creativity, even if they wouldn't have made the same choices themselves. "It's refreshing," one of them said to Paul, shrugging. "Not everything has to look so dull." Paul wasn't deterred. His next tactic was to approach Megan once more, this time with a suggestion. "You know," he said one Saturday morning as Megan planted marigolds, "there are plenty of neighborhoods with people who like this sort of thing. Maybe you'd be happier somewhere else." Megan set down her trowel and looked him square in the eye. "And maybe," she replied with a wry smile, "you'd be happier in a neighborhood with an HOA. They'd love your neutral taste." Paul's eyes widened, and for a moment he was speechless. "I've lived here for 15 years, he finally spat, "and I shouldn't have to move because of people like you." Megan chuckled softly, brushing dirt from her hands. "Then I guess you'll have to get used to a little color, Paul." That was the last straw. Paul stormed back to his house, slamming the door so hard that it rattled the windows. Megan couldn't help but laugh to herself. She had no intention of backing down, and if Paul wanted a fight, she was more than ready to hold her ground. But what Megan didn't realize was that Paul wasn't just annoyed, he was planning something bigger. As she continued to enjoy her blossoming garden and colorful home, Paul stewed in his frustration, determined to put an end to what he saw as Megan's chaotic creativity. The question wasn't whether he would act, but how far he was willing to go. Megan woke the next morning to the sound of angry voices outside her window. She pushed aside the sheer curtains, revealing Paul standing on the sidewalk, gesturing wildly toward her house, while a woman from 3 doors down looked on, her arms crossed. Megan's stomach tightened, but she took a deep breath and told herself it was just another one of Paul's tantrums. She went about her morning routine, determined not to let him ruin her day. By the time she stepped outside to tend to her garden, Paul was gone, but his presence lingered. 2 neighbors gave her sympathetic nods as they walked by, and one of them muttered, "Don't let him get to you." Megan smiled back, but couldn't help wondering what Paul had been saying now. Her worries were confirmed when she noticed something new, a flyer stapled to the community notice board at the end of the street. "Maintaining our neighborhood's character, a call for unity." The title read in bold letters. Below it was a bulleted list of concerns about how certain aesthetic choices were diminishing property values and disrupting the neighborhood's harmony. Though no names were mentioned, it was clear the flyer was aimed at Megan. The pointed references to unconventional house colors and garish gardens left no doubt. Megan felt a mix of anger and disbelief. Paul's obsession had reached a new level. She ripped down the flyer, crumpled it in her hand, and marched back to her house, her jaw set. If Paul thought this would intimidate her, he was sorely mistaken. Later that day, Megan decided to address the issue head-on. She invited a few neighbors over for tea and cookies in her newly painted garden gazebo. Her goal wasn't to defend herself, but to show her neighbors that her colorful choices weren't a threat to the community, but an enhancement. She wanted them to see the charm and care she had poured into her home. To her relief, most of the neighbors were supportive. One elderly woman, Mrs. Harris, admired Megan's painted pavers and remarked, "This garden is like a little slice of joy. We could use more of this in the world." Another neighbor, a young father named Ben, chimed in, "Honestly, Paul's been grumpy since the day I moved in. Don't take it personally." The gathering lifted Megan's spirits. She realized that while Paul's complaints were loud, they weren't the majority. As her guests left, Megan felt a renewed sense of resolve. She wouldn't let Paul's negativity overshadow the vibrant life she was creating. But Paul wasn't ready to give up. The next morning, Megan woke to find a strange sign planted in her yard. In bold black letters, it read, "This is not a theme park." Megan's hands curled into fists as she yanked the sign from the ground. It was petty, juvenile, and entirely Paul's style. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the anger bubbling inside her. Instead of reacting impulsively, Megan hatched a plan. She knew Paul thrived on control and attention, so she decided to do the opposite of what he expected. She ignored the sign and continued adding to her garden, planting a new row of vibrant zinnias along the edge of her walkway. When a neighbor asked about the sign, she laughed it off. "If he thinks this is a theme park," she said with a grin, "then I should start charging admission." The sign, however, wasn't the end of it. A few days later, Megan noticed that some of her flowers had been trampled, and one of her garden flags was missing. She was heartbroken and furious, but instead of confronting Paul without proof, she installed a small security camera overlooking her yard. She hoped she wouldn't have to use it, but it gave her peace of mind. Her patience paid off when the camera captured footage of Paul sneaking into her yard late at night. He stomped on her flowers and ripped down another garden flag, muttering under his breath. Megan couldn't believe it. His behavior had escalated from complaints to outright vandalism. Armed with the evidence, she decided it was time to take action. The next day, Megan paid a visit to her local police department. She showed them the footage and explained the situation. The officer she spoke to was sympathetic and assured her that they would handle it. Later that afternoon, Megan watched from her window as a police car pulled up in front of Paul's house. Two officers knocked on his door, and after a tense conversation, Paul retreated inside, looking both furious and embarrassed. Word spread quickly among the neighbors. Many of them approached Megan to express their support, and a few even volunteered to help her replant the damaged flowers. Paul, on the other hand, seemed to vanish. He kept his blinds drawn and avoided leaving his house whenever possible. A week later, Megan received a handwritten note in her mailbox. It was from Paul. The letter was surprisingly contrite, apologizing for his actions and admitting that he had let his frustrations get the better of him. "I realize now that I've been unfair," he wrote. "Your house and garden aren't the problem. I am. I hope we can coexist peacefully from now on." Megan was skeptical, but decided to accept the apology. She didn't expect them to become friends, but she hoped the ordeal was behind her. Over time, the neighborhood settled back into its usual rhythm. Megan continued to add to her garden, and Paul kept to himself. Occasionally, she would catch him peeking out his window, watching as she painted or planted. She wasn't sure if it was curiosity or resentment, but she chose to see it as progress. For Megan, the experience was a reminder of the importance of standing firm in the face of negativity. Her home was a reflection of her joy, and no amount of complaints or sabotage could take that away from her. As she sipped her coffee one morning, admiring the soft peach tones of her house against the blooming garden, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The colors weren't just paint and flowers, they were a celebration of individuality, a testament to resilience, and a symbol of the beauty that comes from staying true to oneself. Thanks for watching Threads of Kindness. Today, we witnessed the power of standing up for yourself and others, proving that kindness and strength can rewrite any story. If you loved what you saw, hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories of courage and heart. Until we meet again, keep spreading kindness in your corner of the world.